Sam lived in a quiet corner of town where life moved slowly and without much change. His house stood at the very end of a long narrow road, just before the trees of the old forest began. That road was more than a stretch of pavement to him. For years, Sam had treated it as his own responsibility. When cracks opened, he poured gravel. When potholes grew, he filled them. In winter, when snow fell thick, he cleared it with a shovel while neighbors watched from their windows. The road had never been claimed by the city or maintained by any group. It was simply there, and Sam cared for it because no one else did. He took pride in it. To him, that road represented effort and honesty. Visitors sometimes said, "This road looks better than the ones the city repairs." Sam would smile, not boasting, but quietly glad that his work had meaning. He liked order, he liked fairness, and he liked knowing that something was safe because he had made it so. One summer morning, Sam opened his mailbox and found an envelope with bold letters on top. The letters spelled HOA. At first, he thought it must be a mistake. He had never joined the homeowners association. He had never signed a form or agreed to any of their rules. Still, the letter inside was clear. It stated that the road outside his home was now property of the HOA. They called it a community asset. Sam read the letter 3 times while standing at his kitchen counter. The words felt heavy and unreal. The letter claimed that the road would now be under the authority of the association, which meant new rules, new fees, and new restrictions. Sam folded the paper carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and sat in silence for a long while. How could something he had maintained for years be taken without even asking him? Within a week, changes began. The HOA installed signs at the corners of the street. The posts stood tall, painted in bright white, and on them were lists of rules written in sharp black paint. The signs declared that no car could park without a permit. Visitors could only stay if they were reported in advance. No exceptions would be tolerated. Sam stood one morning with a mug of coffee in his hand, staring at the sign. His neighbors passed by and shook their heads quietly. They were unhappy, but they did not argue. Soon the association began to charge fees. Neighbors spoke in hushed voices about how much they had to pay. Some complained about how unfair it was, but most of them gave in quickly. They were afraid of fines or warnings. Sam, however, did not pay. He did not believe the association had the right to control the road that he had cared for with his own hands. Sam noticed how the change spread through the neighborhood. Cars that once parked freely now lined up carefully within painted spaces. Guards hired by the HOA walked with clipboards, making notes about who lived where and who had permission to park. The freedom of the street was gone. It was no longer a simple road where children rode bikes or neighbors talked in the evenings. It had become a place of rules and control. At first, Sam tried to ignore it. He told himself he could still live quietly and let them play their game. But every time he saw the signs or the guards, his patience thinned. He felt as if a piece of his life had been stolen, not just a strip of pavement but also the years of care he had given. The road that once connected him to his home now felt like a fence built against him. Sam was not a man who argued loudly. He was not quick to anger. But he was steady, and when he felt something was unfair, he did not forget. Deep inside, a thought began to form. If they could take without asking, then he could answer in his own way. He did not yet know how or when, but his mind began to turn like a wheel, slow and firm. The neighbors around him carried on, pretending to adjust to the new rules. They whispered their worries but paid their fees. Sam stood apart from them, watching every new step the association took. Each guard who passed by with a clipboard, each car forced to carry a permit, each small freedom lost only made his thoughts sharper. The road had been taken from him in words on paper, but Sam knew that paper did not change the truth. He had built it, cared for it, and protected it. It had never been theirs. A seed of resolve grew in his heart. He would not fight them with shouts or arguments. He would choose another way, a way they would not expect. Sam woke early one morning and stepped outside as the sun spread a pale orange light across the road. The air was cool, and birds sang in the trees, but his eyes went straight to the fresh paint that the HOA workers had placed during the night. White lines divided the road into parking spaces, each marked with a number. At the end of the row, a sign stood tall that read, "Unauthorized vehicles will be towed." Sam walked slowly along the road, his hands resting behind his back. The street he had once cared for felt strange now, like a place that belonged to strangers. It had lost its warmth. The workers had moved in quietly, leaving no chance for anyone to stop them. As he reached the corner, he saw his neighbor, Nora, standing near her car. She looked tired, holding a slip of paper in her hand. Sam greeted her and asked what was wrong. Nora handed him the paper, and his eyes scanned the printed words. It was a fine from the HOA for parking in the wrong space. Nora's voice shook as she explained that she had parked outside her own house, but because her permit listed a different number, they had charged her a fee. "They are taking too much control," she said, her eyes filling with worry. "But what can we do, Sam? They say if we argue, we will get more fines." Sam listened carefully and gave the paper back to her. He spoke calmly, telling her not to worry. Yet inside, his thoughts grew heavier. Nora's problem was only the beginning. As days passed, Sam noticed more neighbors struggling. One man named Ravi had visitors from out of town, but the guards refused to let them park unless he paid extra. Another neighbor, Maria, had her car towed even though she had paid the monthly fee. She spent hours on the phone with the association, but they kept passing her from one voice to another, never solving the problem. The neighborhood changed in mood. Where people once greeted each other with smiles, now they only shared nervous glances. Conversations grew short and filled with complaints. The guards walked proudly, as if the road was theirs alone. The sound of clipboards snapping shut became a reminder that rules were being enforced every hour. Sam stayed quiet, but he watched closely. He noticed the guards always came at the same time each evening. He saw where the association kept their records and how they used stickers on car windows to track payments. He even noticed which cars belonged to the board members of the HOA, always parked neatly in the first row, untouched by tickets or warnings. One evening, Sam sat on his porch with a notebook in hand. He wrote down everything he had seen, the routines, the unfair actions, the names of people who suffered. He was not writing for the sake of keeping records. He was building a plan, even if he did not yet know the full shape of it. Later that night, his neighbor Ravi walked over and sat beside him. The moon was high, and the road looked silver under its light. Ravi sighed and said, "We cannot live like this, Sam. It feels like they own us, not just the road." Sam nodded. He had been thinking the same. He told Ravi that things would not stay this way forever. He did not explain what he meant, but his tone was firm enough that Ravi looked at him with new hope. Inside, Sam's thoughts hardened into resolve. The HOA had taken without asking. They had ignored the years of work he had put into the road. They had forced rules and fees on people who only wanted peace. Sam decided he would not fight them with letters or with arguments, because that was the path they expected. Instead, he would strike in a way they could not prepare for. For now, he kept his plan hidden. He walked the road every morning, nodding politely to neighbors and even greeting the guards with a calm face. But behind his quiet smile, he was measuring every detail, every weakness. The road had once been his to care for, and though they had taken it, Sam knew he still had the power to remind them that nothing truly belonged to those who ruled with greed. The storm was gathering, and only Sam knew how strong it would become. Sam's days grew quieter on the outside, but inside his mind, they grew louder. Every step he took along the road felt like part of a study. Every car, every guard, every small action of the HOA added to a picture forming in his thoughts. He noticed things others overlooked. The board members of the association parked their cars in the same spots every night. The guards rotated on a fixed schedule, always leaving gaps of 10 or 15 minutes between their rounds. The office where the records were kept had 1-week lock, and its windows were never closed fully. To neighbors, these were small details, but to Sam, they were threads that could be woven into a plan. One afternoon, Sam sat at his table with the notebook open. He wrote simple lists: which cars belonged to which board member, what times the guards came by, how many warning slips had been given, which neighbors were most angry and which were too afraid to act. He did not share the notebook with anyone. He knew if his plan was spoken too soon, it would lose its power. The HOA worked through fear, and fear spread faster when people whispered. Sam wanted silence, so he kept his mouth closed and let his pen do the talking. Nora stopped by one evening with cookies, hoping to thank him for listening to her earlier. She looked at his notebook on the table and asked what he was writing. Sam smiled and closed it gently. He said it was only thoughts about the neighborhood. Nora did not press him further, but her eyes showed curiosity. Sam knew she was waiting for someone to stand up against the rules, but she could not imagine how. At night, when the neighborhood slept, Sam stayed awake. He walked outside, pretending to check his garden, but in truth, he was testing the timing of the guards. He counted the minutes between their steps, learning how long it took for them to walk from one end of the road to the other. The night air was calm, and the shadows gave him cover. He moved like someone blending into the silence. The more he watched, the clearer his plan became. He wanted to strike in a way that would not bring noise or violence, but still remind the HOA that power was not in their papers or their signs. Power lived in action. And action could be taken by anyone, even a man who lived quietly at the end of the road. One night, Sam stood at his porch, staring at the row of cars lined up neatly under the painted numbers. Most belonged to the board members. Their polished surfaces reflected the street lights like mirrors. They stood as symbols of control, proof that the board thought they were untouchable. Sam's lips tightened as he thought, if they can take my road, I can take what they love most. He did not mean to destroy or harm. He meant to make them feel what it was like to lose without being asked. Just as they had done to him. The next morning, Sam tested his idea with something small. He took a set of chalks he had once bought for neighborhood children and drew faint marks on the pavement near the board members' cars. Simple arrows, pointing in random directions. Nobody noticed them at first. But later in the day, the guards grew confused when they saw the marks, thinking they were signs left by someone else. They argued quietly among themselves, and Sam watched from a distance, hiding a small smile. His test worked. He could act without being seen. The neighbors still lived under worry. Maria's car was once again given a warning, and Ravi received another notice for visitors. People grumbled, but no one dared to push back. Sam understood. Fear had locked their voices. That was why his own steps had to remain silent until the right moment. Each night, Sam's walks grew bolder. He moved closer to the parked cars, memorizing details, which ones had alarms, which ones did not, which were left unlocked by careless owners. The street lights buzzed faintly above him, but his steps stayed soft on the pavement. He felt as though the road itself was guiding him, the same road he had cared for all those years. In his mind, he repeated the thought again and again: they had taken his road without asking, so he would take something of theirs without asking. He was not rushing. He was preparing, step by step, until the night arrived when his silence would turn into action. The storm he carried inside was almost ready to break. The night was cool when Sam finally decided it was time. For weeks, he had walked the road, counted the steps of the guards, and studied every weakness. Now his patience had grown into a plan that was ready to be set in motion. The neighborhood was silent, windows dark, only the soft hum of streetlights filling the air. Sam slipped on his dark jacket and stepped out quietly, carrying nothing but his calm determination. He walked slowly at first, just as he had on many other nights, blending with the stillness so no one would suspect. The row of cars belonging to the board members gleamed faintly under the lamps. They were lined up proudly, each one polished and standing as a symbol of control. Sam studied them with the same steady eyes he had used when fixing the road in past years. He did not feel nervous. He felt focused. He moved close to the first car, a silver sedan parked nearest to the corner. His hand brushed the side mirror, and he smiled faintly. The door was unlocked. He did not take anything. Instead, he pushed the gear into neutral and slowly rolled the car down the slight slope toward the trees at the edge of the road. The car moved silently, its tires whispering against the pavement, until it was hidden behind the first line of trees. Sam returned to the row and repeated the same with another car. This one was heavier, but he leaned into it with quiet strength, pushing until it too slipped into the shadows. One by one, he moved the cars. Some he guided into empty driveways of houses where no one lived. Others he tucked carefully between tall bushes at the side of the road. He did not damage a single one. He only made them vanish from their proud display. Hours passed, but Sam's work was steady. The night seemed to help him, wrapping him in silence and keeping his steps soft. By the time the moon sank lower, almost every board member's car was gone from the neat row. The street looked strangely empty, as if the power of the association had been erased with a single sweep. When the first light of dawn touched the sky, Sam returned to his porch. He sat with a cup of tea, watching the neighborhood wake up. One by one, the guards arrived. Their eyes widened as they stared at the empty row. They spoke quickly to each other, running up and down the street, searching for the missing vehicles. Sam kept his calm face, as though he knew nothing at all. Soon, the board members themselves came out. Their confusion turned to panic as they searched the street. Some shouted at the guards, demanding answers. Others ran toward the corners, hoping their cars had been towed by mistake. The whole neighborhood gathered, whispering about what had happened. Nora stood beside Sam on his porch and asked, "Where do you think the cars went?" Sam only shrugged and said, "Perhaps they learned what it feels like to lose something without warning." His tone was quiet, but his words carried weight. Nora gave him a curious look, as if she suspected he knew more, but she said nothing. The HOA held an emergency meeting that very afternoon. They blamed the guards for being careless and promised to investigate. Notices were sent to every house, warning that the act was serious and would not be tolerated. But behind their strict words, the board members carried fear. For the first time, they had been touched by the same feeling they had given to others, loss without choice. Neighbors whispered excitedly. Some were afraid, but many felt a secret joy. Maria smiled for the first time in weeks, saying the board deserved the shock. Ravi laughed softly, telling his children that maybe fairness was finally waking up in their street. Sam stayed silent, listening to the voices but not joining. He had done what he planned, yet he knew this was only the beginning. The HOA would not stop with one lesson. They would grow harsher, trying to hold control even tighter. Sam understood that his work was not finished. The first move had been made, but the game was only starting. As night fell again, the road looked different. There were fewer signs of power, fewer cars lined up as trophies. The neighbors carried whispers of hope, but also questions. Sam, sitting on his porch, looked at the road he had once cared for. He felt the calmness of someone who knew he had struck the first blow in silence. The storm he carried was no longer waiting. It had begun. The morning after the cars disappeared, the neighborhood felt different. It was quiet, but there was a tension in the air, a mixture of fear and curiosity. The board members of the HOA moved quickly, checking every corner, counting their vehicles, and speaking loudly into phones. Their anger was obvious, but so was their worry. They did not know who had done it or how, and that uncertainty made them uneasy. Sam watched from his porch as the chaos unfolded. He sipped his coffee and kept his calm expression. To anyone looking, he was just a man enjoying the morning sun. But inside, he was pleased with the results of his careful plan. He had made a point without a single word, without harming a person, and without breaking anything valuable. The lesson was clear: taking without asking had consequences. Nora walked past, holding her child's hand. She stopped near Sam and whispered, "Do you think they will come after us?" Sam shook his head calmly. "They will search for answers, but no one will find what is hidden unless they are careful. For now, just watch." Nora nodded and smiled quietly, relief showing in her eyes. The board members gathered in small groups, arguing over what to do next. Some suggested hiring more guards. Others talked about fines and stricter rules. They could not understand how all the cars had vanished without any sign of damage. Their frustration grew, and their control over the neighborhood began to feel weaker. Meanwhile, neighbors began to notice subtle changes in themselves. Without the cars lining the street, they felt lighter. Children could run freely, and neighbors could speak to each other without fear of reprimand. Maria stepped outside with a broom to sweep the pavement. She laughed softly as she saw the empty spaces where cars had once been parked. "It feels like we have our street back," she said quietly to Ravi. He nodded, smiling. Sam observed quietly from his porch. He had no need to join their conversations. His satisfaction came from seeing the quiet shift in energy across the neighborhood. The board members were frustrated, but the residents were beginning to feel free again. This was his goal: to remind them that rules were meant for fairness, not control. The HOA quickly placed temporary barriers and added more signs, but the tension they tried to create was different. People were no longer afraid to move around. Even the guards seemed nervous, glancing frequently at the empty spaces where cars had once stood. Sam had taught them an unspoken lesson: fear could not always maintain power. That evening, Sam took a slow walk down the street. The air was filled with the soft sounds of the neighborhood settling after the morning chaos. He noticed small details: footprints on the pavement, a misplaced broom left by Maria, leaves blown across the road. Every detail reminded him that he had moved silently, without anyone noticing, and yet he had changed the balance of the street. Ravi caught up with him and said quietly, "I don't know how you did it, Sam, but you gave us hope. I've never seen them so powerless." Sam smiled faintly. "It's not about showing power, Ravi. It's about showing that respect cannot be taken by force. Sometimes, it must be reminded quietly." Ravi nodded, his eyes reflecting both admiration and understanding. The HOA was forced to call a meeting that evening. Their faces were tight with frustration, and they demanded answers. But the missing cars could not be explained. The board members looked around nervously, realizing that no threats or fines would recover what had been hidden. The neighborhood had quietly shifted. Control had been challenged without a fight. As Sam returned to his porch, he felt a quiet satisfaction. His plan had worked perfectly. He had reminded the board that taking something without asking was not just unfair, it could be noticed and reversed in subtle ways. The storm he carried had moved from thought to action, and the first effects were clear. Night fell, and the road looked calm again. Street lights flickered on, casting soft shadows across the empty parking spaces. The cars had vanished, but the lesson lingered. Sam sat quietly, knowing that this was only the beginning. The HOA had been reminded, but more steps were needed to ensure fairness remained on the street he had once cared for alone. He smiled faintly. The road was no longer just a stretch of pavement. It was a statement, a reminder, and a place of quiet power. The next few days brought a strange mix of calm and tension to the neighborhood. The missing cars had shaken the HOA board members, but they tried to act as if nothing had happened. Guards walked faster, cameras were checked constantly, and signs were added along the street. They hoped their presence alone would remind everyone who was in control. Sam watched quietly from his porch. He did not need to rush or act openly. He had already shown them that rules could not replace respect. Still, he kept observing. Every detail mattered. Every guard who glanced nervously at the empty spaces, every board member who whispered in worry, reminded him that the balance of power had shifted. Neighbors began talking more openly. Nora shared her thoughts with Maria and Ravi about how unfair the HOA had been. Children ran along the road, no longer afraid to ride bikes near the empty spaces where the cars had once stood. Small conversations between neighbors became louder. Sam listened to them from his porch, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. But he also knew that the board would not accept defeat quietly. He had seen their panic, and he understood that they would find ways to regain control. Sam realized he needed to be careful. One wrong move, and the HOA could increase restrictions, hire more guards, or bring in legal threats. His plan had to remain precise and measured. One evening, as the sun set, Sam noticed the board members gathering near the center of the street. They spoke in low voices, pointing to maps and making notes. Their frustration was clear, but they were cautious. Sam imagined their thoughts. They had been shaken, but they would try to recover. He smiled faintly. That was exactly why he had acted in silence. He had not broken any laws. He had not damaged property. He had only reminded them that respect could not be forced. Now, they were left guessing, unsure of what else might happen. That night, Sam decided to make another small move, not to harm anyone, but to show the neighborhood that their power could be questioned without conflict. He walked quietly along the road and moved small objects around, garden chairs slightly turned, small decorations shifted, and chalk marks made on the pavement near the guard posts. No one would notice these changes at first glance, but they would create a subtle sense of unease. When the guards arrived for their evening rounds, they frowned. The small changes made them uneasy, and their reports became longer, filled with confusion. Sam watched from a distance, hidden in the shadows. He felt a quiet thrill. It was working again. The neighborhood was beginning to see that control could be challenged quietly and effectively. Inside, Sam knew that this was only part of a larger plan. The HOA still controlled the letters, the fees, and the official rules, but the real control, the respect of the residents, was beginning to shift. Sam had no desire to destroy or humiliate anyone. He only wanted balance. If they could take the road without asking, he could show that the road, and the neighborhood, still belonged to the people who lived there. The next morning, whispers of the night's subtle changes spread quickly. Neighbors spoke to each other in low tones, sharing the experience. Some smiled nervously, realizing that they were no longer completely under the HOA's control. Others laughed quietly, feeling a small sense of victory. Sam sat on his porch, smiling faintly. The street felt alive again. Even the board members noticed the changes. Their frustration grew, and they tried to tighten rules, adding more signs and cameras. But the quiet resistance of the neighborhood continued to spread. Sam knew they could never fully control people who had begun to think for themselves. The road that had once been taken from him without asking was now alive with quiet strength. Sam had started a movement of subtle defiance, and the lesson was clear: power through fear was fragile, and fairness could not be ignored. As night fell once again, Sam walked the road slowly, feeling the calm that only comes from knowing that action, patience, and careful thought can change the course of events without a single shout. The storm he had started continued to grow, and he was ready for the next steps. The sun rose slowly over the neighborhood, casting a soft light on the quiet street. The empty parking spaces where the board members' cars had once been reflected the morning glow. Sam stepped outside and took a deep breath, feeling the calm that comes after careful planning and quiet action. The road had changed, and so had the balance of the neighborhood. The board members gathered once again, their faces tight with tension. They spoke in hushed tones, whispering about the missing cars and the mysterious shifts that had happened during the nights. Their frustration was clear, but so was their uncertainty. No one had seen Sam act, and that made their power feel weaker. They tried to tighten rules and add more guards, but the quiet confidence of the residents could not be shaken. Sam watched from his porch as neighbors stepped outside for the first time in days without fear. Children ran down the street on bikes, their laughter filling the air. Maria smiled as she watered her garden near the edge of the pavement. Ravi and Nora spoke in low voices, their gestures relaxed. Even neighbors who had been nervous before now moved with calm confidence. Sam realized that he had done more than hide the cars. He had restored a sense of safety, freedom, and respect to the people who lived there. The HOA called an emergency meeting in the afternoon, but this time the board members were cautious. They could no longer act with the same arrogance. They spoke politely, trying to regain control, but the residents had grown silent, watching and waiting. The street felt alive with the quiet strength of those who understood that respect could not be taken with rules alone. Sam knew that his work was almost complete. He had acted with careful planning and patience. Every move had been calculated, every detail considered. He had shown the board members that taking without asking could be challenged in ways they could not predict. And more importantly, he had reminded the neighborhood that their voices and actions mattered, even if they had once been afraid. That evening, Sam took a slow walk along the road. The street lights glowed softly, casting long shadows across the pavement. He paused at the spots where the cars had been moved. The board members' vehicles were hidden in safe places, untouched and unharmed. The lesson had been taught without violence, without confrontation, and without causing damage. The power of careful planning had worked. Nora joined him quietly. She glanced at the empty spaces and said, "It feels like we can breathe again. The street feels ours." Sam nodded. "It is," he said simply. "We all care for it, and now they understand that it cannot belong to anyone who takes without respect." Ravi smiled as he approached. "You have shown us something important, Sam. Sometimes, action does not need shouting. It needs thought, patience, and care." Sam nodded again, feeling the truth of his words. The quiet strength of the neighborhood was stronger than any rule on paper. By the next morning, the HOA had started returning the cars to their rightful owners, but the lesson had left a mark. Board members moved cautiously, aware that their previous arrogance had consequences. The residents moved freely, no longer fearful of arbitrary rules. The street had returned to life, but it had also gained something more important: balance. Sam stood on his porch, watching the sun rise higher. The road was quiet, calm, and free, just as it had always been in the mornings when he cared for it. He smiled faintly, knowing that his careful planning and patient action had restored fairness. The street belonged to those who respected it and to those who had cared for it, and the HOA had been reminded that respect could not be forced. As he looked along the quiet pavement, Sam understood that true power was not in control, signs, or rules. True power came from action, patience, and knowing the value of what belongs to everyone. The storm he had carried through the nights had settled into calm, leaving a neighborhood stronger than before. And with that, Sam stepped back into his home, satisfied. The road was safe, the lesson was learned, and the balance had been restored.